On a sweltering Italian afternoon in mid-September of 1943, a German staff officer stood transfixed by a sight that contradicted every principle of military engineering he had been trained to believe. Oberst Dietrich Peltz, temporarily assigned to Field Marshal Kesselring's command structure, watched through field glasses as American transport aircraft executed landing approaches over terrain that his own reconnaissance had classified as agricultural land just 3 days prior. The wheat field that had existed earlier in the week now gleamed with the distinctive sheen of metal, transformed into a fully operational military airstrip. His pencil moved rapidly across the observation log, recording details that seemed impossible even as he witnessed them firsthand. The date was September 15th, and the location was Montecorvino Airfield, near Salerno. What Peltz documented that day would fundamentally reshape German understanding of how their adversary prosecuted modern warfare. The Allied invasion force had come ashore a mere 6 days earlier, yet the airfield before him already supported 17 functioning aircraft. This violated every assumption embedded in Wehrmacht tactical doctrine. According to the planning manuals that governed German military operations, establishing even a basic forward airfield required no less than 6 weeks of intensive labour, and that timeline assumed favourable weather, cooperative terrain, and the complete absence of enemy interference. The Americans had somehow accomplished this feat while under constant artillery bombardment and aerial attack, completing the work in less time than it typically took German units to establish a field command post. The American C-47 Skytrains continued their approach patterns, their wheels touching down on steel matting that reflected the afternoon sunlight. The material had been laid across the Italian landscape like an enormous carpet, covering ground that German engineering assessments had dismissed as fundamentally unsuitable for aviation operations without months of preparatory work. 27 German staff officers would eventually fall into Allied hands during the subsequent northward push through the Italian peninsula, and their interrogation reports would reveal a consistent theme of complete bewilderment regarding American construction capabilities. None of these experienced military professionals understood that they were witnessing the opening act of a systematic demolition of centuries-old assumptions about how wars were fought and won. The transformation taking place across Italy represented something far more significant than mere tactical surprise. The fundamental mathematics governing air superiority were being rewritten, not through revolutionary aircraft designs or pilot training methods, but through construction timelines that violated what German military engineers had considered the immutable laws of physics and logistics. The revelation had actually commenced 4 days before Peltz made his observations, when Allied assault forces had stormed the beaches at Salerno on September 9th. Mixed in with the first wave of landing craft were vehicles that German defensive positions initially failed to properly identify. General Major Rudolf Sickenius, whose 16th Panzer Division Reconnaissance Battalion monitored the landing zones, filed reports describing American trucks loaded with what appeared to be perforated sheets of steel, thousands upon thousands of them, stacked in configurations that resembled oversized playing cards. The intelligence officers analyzing these initial reports concluded that the materials were probably temporary road surfacing, perhaps intended to help supply vehicles navigate the muddy terrain that characterized much of coastal Italy. None of them conceived that these innocuous-looking steel sheets represented a revolutionary technology that would transform the nature of military operations. The perforated steel planking, known within American military circles by the acronym PSP, was about to demonstrate capabilities that would leave German observers struggling to comprehend what they were witnessing. The origins of this transformation could be traced to an obscure location in North Carolina, where American engineers had conducted experiments that German military attachés had actually observed and reported upon, only to have their dispatches dismissed in Berlin as obvious propaganda. Near the small town of Marston, in November of 1941, American engineering battalions had accomplished something that German planning doctrine classified as impossible. They had constructed a 3,000-foot runway capable of handling heavy bomber operations in just 11 days. The secret to this achievement lay in a design that appeared deceptively simple when examined in isolation. Each individual mat measured 10 feet in length and 15 inches in width, weighing 66 pounds. The steel was perforated with 87 precisely engineered holes that reduced weight while maintaining structural integrity. The mats interlocked through a system of hooks and slots, creating a continuous surface that could support massive loads while remaining flexible enough to adapt to minor terrain irregularities. German military attachés stationed in Washington had actually witnessed demonstrations of this technology and filed detailed reports describing what they had observed. The responses from Wehrmacht headquarters in Berlin revealed a fundamental failure of imagination. The reports were categorized as American propaganda, dismissed as yet another example of the exaggeration and boastfulness that German analysts associated with American culture. Hauptmann Wilhelm Schultz, an officer in the Wehrmacht Engineering Corps, would later attempt to explain this failure of perception in an analysis written during his post-war internment. The explanation he offered revealed deep-seated cultural assumptions that had blinded German military thinking to the reality of American capabilities. According to Schultz, German military culture had concluded that American society was fundamentally soft, that its emphasis on comfort and convenience had produced a population incapable of the harsh improvisations that warfare demanded. The irony, as Schultz ruefully acknowledged, was that this very characteristic had driven Americans to engineer comfort directly into battlefield operations. Rather than accepting discomfort as an inevitable aspect of military service, American military culture had channeled enormous resources into eliminating that discomfort through technological solutions. This approach represented a philosophical divergence from European military tradition that German observers had completely failed to anticipate. The first documented encounter between Wehrmacht forces and American rapid runway construction had actually occurred months earlier, halfway around the world on Guadalcanal. Japanese reports reaching Berlin through diplomatic channels in late 1942 contained descriptions of American engineers repairing bomb-cratered runways in hours rather than the days that Japanese military doctrine assumed such work required. The Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the High Command overseeing all German military operations, had dismissed these accounts as attempts by the Japanese to excuse their failures in the Solomon Islands campaign. General Alfred Jodl had reportedly characterized the reports as Japanese officers seeing phantoms to explain away their defeats. But the phantoms were entirely real. The 804th Engineer Aviation Battalion had come ashore with the Marine Assault Forces in August of 1942, inheriting a partially completed Japanese airstrip that was under constant attack from both naval bombardment and air raids. Within days, despite these ongoing attacks, they had transformed the rudimentary facility into a base capable of supporting continuous combat operations. The Japanese defenders, whose own engineering doctrine allocated weeks for such construction work, had watched in growing disbelief as American bulldozers, operating around the clock in shifts, accomplished in mere hours what Japanese manual labor crews achieved only after days of intensive effort. Lieutenant Colonel Friedrich von Kleist found himself captured at Salerno while commanding an artillery battery, and he spent countless hours interrogating his American captors about their engineering methodologies. He struggled to accept the explanations they provided, unable to reconcile what they described with his understanding of how military construction operated. Letters he wrote to his wife during his captivity, discovered decades later in American military archives, revealed his mental struggle to process what he had witnessed. The Americans, he wrote, spoke of laying runways with the same casual tone one might use to describe spreading a tablecloth across a dinner table. They had somehow mechanized processes that German military culture considered inherently dependent on massive labor inputs and extended timelines. The true shock for German commanders emerged when they began to comprehend the scale of American production capacity. Manufacturing the steel matting required extraordinary precision. Each piece had to be engineered to exacting tolerances to ensure that the interlocking mechanisms would function properly when assembled in the field. The hooks and slots connecting each mat required manufacturing precision of less than 1/16th of an inch. German industry, despite its well-deserved reputation for engineering excellence, struggled to maintain such standards while producing the thousands of precision components required for aircraft manufacturing each month. The Americans, impossibly, were producing 3 million square feet of PSP matting every single month by the middle of 1943. This represented enough material to construct 10 complete heavy bomber bases monthly. At a single facility, the Carnegie Illinois Steel Company, 5 separate production lines operated continuously, 24 hours per day, 7 days per week. Raw steel arrived from Pennsylvania mills, was pressed into the required shape by massive hydraulic machines exerting 2,000 tons of pressure, punched with the precise pattern of holes developed by Army Corps of Engineers specifications, and shipped to Atlantic ports, often before the protective paint coating had fully dried. Workers at the facility would later recall that the factory floor became so intensely hot from the continuous operation of the pressing machinery that management had to institute a policy of rotating shifts every 2 hours to prevent heat exhaustion among the workforce. The logistical systems that delivered these materials to active combat zones defied German comprehension of what was militarily possible. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commanding all German forces in Italy, would later perform calculations demonstrating that moving the materials required for a single American airfield required more shipping tonnage than the entire Wehrmacht possessed in the entire Mediterranean theatre. Yet the Americans were simultaneously constructing dozens of such airfields while maintaining their regular supply operations without any apparent strain on their logistics network. Colonel Wilhelm Schmalz commanded a Kampfgruppe that had opposed the Allied landings in Sicily, and his meticulous documentation of American engineering operations survived in Wehrmacht archives, providing a window into German perceptions of what they were facing. On July 13, 1943, Schmalz's reconnaissance units began observing American engineers starting work on an airfield construction project near the town of Gela. His report documented a timeline that seemed to mock everything German military engineering taught. On the first day, American forces cleared vegetation using armored bulldozers that operated with apparent impunity to sniper fire. The second day saw ground leveling accomplished by machines working through darkness, using illumination that German forces would never have dared to employ for fear of attracting enemy fire. The third day brought the arrival of the steel matting, transported on what appeared to be endless convoys of trucks. By the fourth day, fighter aircraft were already conducting landing operations. Schmalz's conclusion was stark. This was not warfare as German military culture understood it. This represented industrial conquest executed at a pace that violated all traditional military assumptions. The aviation engineer units themselves embodied a revolution in military organization that German doctrine had never contemplated. By 1943, more than 118,000 American troops were dedicated exclusively to airfield construction, organized into specialized battalions and equipped with machinery that seemed almost fantastical to German observers. Each individual battalion possessed equipment valued at more than an entire German panzer company. The inventory included 7D bulldozers capable of moving 20 tons of earth in minutes, graders that could level terrain faster than 100 men working with hand tools, and pneumatic drills that could penetrate rock that German pioneers would have required explosives to break through. Sergeant Klaus Müller served as a Wehrmacht pioneer before his capture in Sicily, and his testimony during interrogation revealed the psychological impact of witnessing American engineering operations. A single American operator on a bulldozer, he observed, accomplished more earth moving in 1 hour than his entire company could achieve in a week of intensive manual labor. But the advantage extended beyond mere mechanical capability. The systematic approach employed by American engineers impressed him as much as their equipment. They executed procedures that had been standardized and timed to the minute. While German engineers were still conducting initial surveys of a site, American units were already landing aircraft on completed runways. The operational history of the 814th Engineer Aviation Battalion was captured intact when their headquarters was temporarily overrun near Foggia, providing German intelligence with unprecedented insight into American capabilities. The documentation revealed accomplishments that seemed impossible even when described in official military records. Over a 5-week period in Sicily, this single battalion had constructed or repaired 13 separate airfields. They had removed 6,000 landmines without suffering a single casualty, employing magnetic detection equipment that German pioneers had no knowledge even existed. They had laid 2.5 million square feet of PSP matting, graded 3.5 million cubic yards of earth, and installed drainage systems that transformed swampy lowlands into all-weather runways capable of year-round operations. German intelligence officers initially refused to accept the authenticity of these captured documents. Oberst Hermann Balck, who would later command a panzer division during the fighting in France, reviewed the materials and declared them obvious fabrications created for deception purposes. His calculations indicated that the work described would require at minimum 10,000 labourers working continuously for 6 months. When intelligence staff informed him that the American battalion actually consisted of fewer than 800 men, he accused them of professional incompetence and demanded they verify their sources. The systematic nature of American airfield construction proved particularly unsettling to German observers who studied their methods. The entire process had been standardized to an extraordinary degree. Site selection, surveying, clearing, grading, drainage installation, matting deployment and facility construction proceeded according to detailed manuals that reduced complex engineering challenges to simple checklists that could be executed by relatively inexperienced troops following standardized procedures. A captured American technical manual, designated TM5-255 and titled Aviation Engineers, became mandatory reading for German staff officers attempting to understand what they were facing. They struggled to comprehend its casual assumption that any piece of relatively flat terrain could be transformed into an operational airfield within 72 hours. Lieutenant General Fridolin von Senger und Ettelin commanded the 14th Panzer Corps in Italy, with headquarters overlooking the Rapido River Valley. From this elevated position, he possessed an excellent vantage point for observing American engineering operations in the valley below. He watched as the Americans constructed an entire complex of airfields despite German artillery positioned on the commanding heights that should have made such construction impossible. His post-war memoirs reflected on this experience with a tone of weary resignation. The Germans could destroy American construction work each night, creating craters in runways and demolishing facilities. Each morning, however, the damage had been repaired before German pilots finished their breakfast. This was not a conventional battle against an enemy military force, but rather a struggle against an industrial process that never stopped, never tired, and always recovered faster than it could be damaged. The repair capabilities demonstrated by American aviation engineers proved even more psychologically devastating than their initial construction speed. German bombing raids, even when successfully executed, achieved only temporary results that disappeared within hours. Luftwaffe technical officers calculated that a 500-kilogram bomb, creating a crater 30 feet wide and 15 feet deep, should render a runway unusable for at minimum 48 hours, assuming around-the-clock repair efforts. American engineers routinely had such damage repaired and operational again in 4 to 6 hours. The secret lay not merely in rapid work, but in systematic preparation and standardized procedures that had been refined through countless repetitions. Aviation engineer battalions maintained stockpiles of PSP specifically earmarked for damage repair. They pre-positioned supplies of gravel, sand, and rapid-setting cement at strategic locations around each airfield. Bulldozers and graders remained on 24-hour standby status. Most remarkably, repair procedures had been standardized to such a degree that crews could execute them in complete darkness, following memorized routines that enabled continuous operations despite German night bombing attacks. Master Sergeant Antonio Benedetti of the 825th Engineer Aviation Battalion described the repair process in a letter home that was subsequently published in the military newspaper Stars and Stripes. According to Benedetti's account, German bombs would typically arrive around 2300 hours. By 2315, American repair crews were already mobilized and moving to the damage sites. Bulldozers pushed debris aside, graders smoothed the crater edges, trucks dumped fill material, compactors leveled the surface, and PSP crews began laying replacement matting sections, all by midnight. By 0200 hours, the steel planking was locked into position and receiving its protective paint coating. By dawn, American fighters were taking off directly over the spots where German bombs had impacted just hours earlier. Benedetti described it as a choreographed dance, with every participant knowing their assigned movements through countless repetitions. The Luftwaffe, already struggling with critical fuel shortages and catastrophic pilot losses, found itself facing an impossible mathematical equation. Every airfield they successfully attacked returned to operational status before they could organize and execute follow-up raids. Meanwhile, new American airfields appeared faster than German intelligence could update their target maps. A Luftwaffe planning document from October 1943 listed 17 Allied airfields in the Foggia complex. By the time German pilots received their operational briefings based on this intelligence, 24 airfields were actually operational, with 7 additional facilities already under active construction. The specifications for American airfield construction seem to violate the laws of physics as understood by German engineers working with traditional construction methodologies. A standard fighter airstrip required 5,000 feet of runway, 150 feet wide, capable of handling aircraft weighing 30,000 pounds while landing at 90 miles per hour. German military doctrine, based on concrete construction techniques, calculated a minimum of 6 weeks for such a project under ideal conditions. The Americans routinely completed equivalent facilities in under 72 hours, under active combat conditions, frequently while under direct enemy observation and artillery fire. General der Panzertruppe Joachim Lemmelsen commanded troops facing American air power throughout the Italian campaign, and his report to the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht reflected his growing understanding that the challenge his forces faced transcended simple questions of aircraft numbers or pilot skill. The enemy's air superiority, he wrote, was fundamentally a question of omnipresence. Wherever German forces attempted to concentrate for offensive operations, an American airfield materialized within days. German forces could not interdict this construction because the Americans built faster than the Wehrmacht could organize attacks against the construction sites. The composition of American aviation engineer battalions fascinated German intelligence officers who interrogated captured American personnel. These units drew specialists from across American civilian society. Civil engineers from state highway departments, equipment operators from mining companies, concrete specialists from major dam construction projects, drainage experts from the Department of Agriculture. One battalion commander had previously managed construction of the Golden Gate Bridge. Another had directed highway construction through the Rocky Mountains. This deep pool of civilian expertise was coupled with equipment that seemed almost miraculous to German observers accustomed to manual labor methods. The Caterpillar D7 bulldozer, which formed the backbone of American airfield construction capabilities, could exert 20,000 pounds of drawbar pull, sufficient to move boulders that would have required German engineers to employ explosives. The Northwest ATD crane could lift entire prefabricated buildings into position. Quickway cranes could unload an entire truck loaded with PSP matting in 3 minutes, work that would have required German pioneers an hour using manual methods. Major Wilhelm Dürr served as a Luftwaffe base commander before his capture in southern France, and he spent weeks as a prisoner of war studying American airfield operations with the intensity of a graduate student researching a doctoral thesis. His post-war analysis, written for United States Air Force Historical Studies, offered insights into German thinking about American methods. German forces, he noted, operated from concrete runways that had been constructed by the organization TOT over periods of months or years, or from grass fields that had been developed over generations. The Americans brought their runways with them, transported like a carpenter carries his tools. This represented not merely a tactical adaptation, but a fundamental philosophical difference that required an entire industrial mindset that German military culture simply did not possess. The rapid construction capability fundamentally altered what was tactically possible in ways that German commanders never successfully adapted to counter. American commanders could establish forward fighter bases literally overnight, providing close air support at ranges that had previously been considered impossible. They could shift the weight of air power along an entire front in days, rather than the weeks traditional logistics required. Most devastatingly from a German perspective, Americans could afford to construct airfields they might never actually use, creating uncertainty that forced German commanders to disperse their already limited resources across wide areas rather than concentrating them effectively. During Operation Dragoon, the Allied invasion of southern France executed in August 1944, American engineers surpassed even their own previous achievements. The 852nd Engineer Aviation Battalion came ashore with the initial assault waves and had an emergency landing strip operational by D+1, just 24 hours after the invasion commenced. By D+3, 2 complete fighter squadrons were operating from French soil. By D+7, American engineers had constructed 3 separate airfields, each capable of handling medium bomber operations. German commanders, whose planning had assumed at minimum 2 weeks before facing significant Allied air power, found their positions under continuous air attack beginning on the second day of the invasion. General der Infanterie Johannes Blaskowitz commanded Army Group G in southern France, and his reports to OKW reflected growing desperation. Enemy tactical air power, he noted, multiplied on a daily basis. Each morning brought reconnaissance reports of new airstrips that had not existed the previous day. German troop movements, restricted to nighttime operations to avoid air attack, were limited to just a few kilometers of travel before dawn revealed them to enemy fighters operating from fields that literally had not existed when darkness fell. The cultural shock extended far beyond mere technical capabilities. German military tradition emphasized permanence, solidity, and careful preparation that would produce installations capable of serving for decades. Luftwaffe bases featured concrete runways 2 feet thick, elaborate drainage systems engineered to last generations, hardened hangars constructed to withstand bombardment, and extensive support facilities built to the highest standards. These installations represented millions of man-hours and Reichsmarks, constituting strategic assets that required careful defense. The American approach, temporary, flexible, almost disposable in nature, represented a conceptual revolution that German military thinking could not accommodate or respond to effectively. Colonel Hans-Ulrich Rudel, the most highly decorated German combat pilot with hundreds of missions flown, observed American operations during his brief stationing in Italy before German forces withdrew northward. His post-war writings reflected on what he had witnessed with something approaching philosophical wonder. German forces had spent 2 years constructing their base at Foggia, investing enormous resources to create what they considered a proper military installation. The Americans rebuilt it completely in 2 weeks after German demolition teams destroyed it during their retreat. But the reconstruction did not replicate German methods. Rather than permanent concrete and solid structures built for the ages, Americans laid steel strips that could be pulled up and relocated tomorrow if necessary. They erected tent hangars that could disappear within hours. They created operational capability without permanent commitment. Rudel characterized it as warfare without weight, an approach fundamentally alien to German military culture. The psychological impact on German troops proved as significant as the purely tactical advantages American engineering provided. Infantry soldiers huddled in foxholes watched American fighters operate from runways built on ground where they themselves had fought just days earlier. Tank crews watched carefully camouflaged positions revealed by reconnaissance aircraft operating from airstrips that had not existed when the tanks had dug into their positions. Artillery observers discovered their targets defended by fighters that scrambled from fields built overnight. Gefreiter Johann Schmidt, an ordinary German soldier whose letters home were preserved by his family, wrote in November 1943 with observations that transcended his modest rank. Schmidt noted that the Americans were not fighting a war in the traditional sense that German soldiers understood. They were building a civilization as they advanced. Wherever American forces moved forward, airports appeared, roads were paved, telephone lines were strung. Germans destroyed, Americans built. Germans retreated from positions they had held for months, only to watch Americans construct airfields in places Germans had occupied just yesterday. Schmidt posed a question that haunted many German soldiers. How could they defeat an enemy who carried his own geography with him, who could manufacture terrain advantages through industrial processes rather than having to fight for naturally favourable ground? The innovation extended far beyond the basic PSP matting that formed the foundation of American airfield construction. American engineers developed specialized equipment for every conceivable challenge they might encounter. The Rome plow, a massive blade designed specifically for clearing vegetation, could remove trees 18 inches in diameter while the vehicle moved at 5 miles per hour. Specialized drilling equipment could create drainage wells through solid rock. Portable rock crushers could convert rubble from bombed buildings into acceptable runway base material. Wehrmacht engineers, many of them highly skilled professionals before military service, found themselves reduced to manual labor while watching American teenagers who had probably never held a shovel before military service operate machinery that could transform entire landscapes. A captured report from the 19th Luftwaffe Field Division noted with barely concealed bewilderment that American soldiers, many appearing no older than 18 years of age, casually operated equipment worth more than entire German engineering companies possessed. The prefabrication revolution particularly stunned German observers who were accustomed to building everything on site from basic materials. Entire airfield facilities arrived in numbered crates, ready for assembly like enormous construction toys designed for children. Control towers 40 feet tall were erected in 8 hours. Hangars covering 15,000 square feet were operational within 2 days of the crates being unloaded. Fuel distribution systems with underground storage tanks and miles of connecting piping were installed in 72 hours. Operations buildings, complete with communications equipment, were functioning within 24 hours of arrival. Lieutenant Colonel Ernst Zimmermann served as a Luftwaffe logistics officer, and he performed detailed calculations, attempting to understand what he was observing. Establishing equivalent facilities using standard German construction methods would require 2,000 tons of concrete, 500 tons of steel reinforcement, 50,000 man-hours of skilled labour, and a minimum timeline of 8 weeks under perfect conditions with no interference. He watched Americans achieve superior results with 100 tons of prefabricated materials, 50 men, and 72 hours of elapsed time. The mathematics simply did not compute according to any framework German military logistics employed. The supply chain supporting this construction miracle defied German comprehension of logistics at every level. Each aviation engineer battalion required 2,000 tons of equipment and supplies to establish a single fighter airfield. A bomber base required 5,000 tons. Yet American Liberty ships, themselves products of revolutionary production methods that reduced construction time from months to weeks, delivered these materials to invasion beaches where specialized landing craft designed specifically for PSP transportation brought them ashore. Within hours of hitting the beach, steel matting was moving inland on trucks manufactured in Detroit, using fuel refined in Texas, following maps printed in Washington, directed by plans created by engineers who had never seen the terrain they were transforming. General der Infanterie Gustav von Zangen commanded the 15th Army facing American forces in Holland, and he described watching American C-47 transport aircraft landing on a runway that his own troops had been defending just 48 hours earlier. His operations officer insisted the grid reference must be incorrect because there was no airfield at that location according to their maps. Zangen had to show him through field glasses, pointing out the aircraft touching down on an installation that had been constructed while German staffs were still writing reports about holding the position. The strategic implications gradually crystallized in German military thinking, though the understanding came too late to develop effective countermeasures. American capability to project air power anywhere, instantly, through rapid airfield construction meant that traditional concepts of front lines became meaningless. Every German position, regardless of how far from established Allied bases, existed under potential immediate air threat. Reserve forces could not concentrate without inviting attack from fighters operating from runways that had not existed when the movement orders were issued. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding all German forces in the West, issued a directive in May 1944 that revealed the Wehrmacht's growing desperation and recognition of the challenge they faced. The directive stated that enemy airfield construction capabilities must be assumed to be essentially unlimited. All planning must assume Allied tactical air support would be available within 72 hours of any landing or breakthrough. Traditional calculations based on distance from known enemy air bases were no longer valid for operational planning purposes. The directive proved prophetic in ways that exceeded even Rundstedt's pessimistic assessment. After D-Day, American engineers performed feats that surpassed even their previous spectacular achievements. Advanced landing grounds appeared across Normandy like mushrooms sprouting after rainfall. ALG-1 near Sainte-Mère-Église achieved operational status on D+3. By D+10, 9 American airfields were operational in Normandy. By D+30, 24 separate airfields supported Allied tactical air operations. German units found themselves under constant attack from aircraft based so close to the front lines that pilots could execute 4 or 5 combat sorties daily, returning to rearm and refuel in minutes rather than the hour or more that distance from bases would normally require. Captain Hermann Buchner served as a Wehrmacht intelligence officer compiling reports on American engineering capabilities, and his post-war analysis written for United States Air Force Historical Studies survived in American military archives. His conclusion was stark and unambiguous. German forces were not defeated by American courage, though American soldiers certainly demonstrated courage. They were not defeated by American weapons, though American equipment was undeniably excellent. They were defeated by American engineers who made geography irrelevant as a military factor. The Americans built their victory, runway by runway, across Europe, and no amount of German tactical skill could overcome that fundamental advantage. The pinnacle of American airfield construction efficiency manifested during the Rhine crossing operations in March 1945. The 834th Engineer Aviation Battalion crossed the Rhine at Remagen and achieved an emergency strip operational on the eastern bank by the end of the second day following the crossing. They were landing C-47 transport aircraft carrying supplies directly to the bridgehead while German commanders were still organizing their response. German defensive planning had assumed several days minimum before Allied air power could effectively support operations beyond the Rhine. Instead, German positions became untenable within hours, as American tactical aircraft operating from the newly constructed strip provided continuous close air support to advancing ground forces. Major General Fritz Bayerlein commanded the elite Panzer Lehr Division, and his report to superiors captured the helplessness German commanders felt in the face of American engineering capabilities. The Americans, he noted, brought their air force with them like artillery pieces. Where American forces arrived in the morning, their aircraft were operating by evening. German forces could not move during daylight, could not concentrate forces, could not mount effective resistance. They had industrialized warfare beyond German comprehension, creating a form of military operations that German doctrine had no framework for understanding or countering. The numbers compiled by war's end told a story that no amount of German courage or tactical brilliance could overcome. American aviation engineer battalions had constructed or reconstructed over 1,000 airfields across Europe and the Pacific theatres. They had laid over 300 million square feet of PSP matting, sufficient material to construct a continuous runway extending from Berlin to Moscow. They had moved 500 million cubic yards of earth, graded 50 million square yards of surface area, and installed 1,000 miles of drainage piping. They had accomplished in months what German military engineers calculated would require decades using conventional construction methods. General Werner Kreiper served as Chief of Staff of the Luftwaffe, and his final assessment delivered in American captivity captured the totality of German miscalculation regarding the nature of modern warfare. German forces, he explained, had prepared for a war of armies and battles, of courage and sacrifice, of tactical brilliance and operational art. The Americans fought an entirely different kind of war, one of production and engineering, of efficiency and logistics, of industrial capacity systematically applied to military problems. Germans believed warfare was an art form requiring genius and inspiration. Americans proved it was an industry requiring organization and resources. Every crashed American aircraft was replaced within days. Every cratered runway was operational by dawn. German forces could destroy, but Americans could create. And creation, in the end, proved more powerful than destruction. Wehrmacht veterans interviewed decades after the war's conclusion consistently identified American engineering capabilities as the most psychologically devastating aspect of facing Western Allied forces. Unlike combat operations, which German military tradition had prepared them to understand and execute, the industrial transformation of warfare left them conceptually defenseless. They could comprehend being outfought by superior tactics or courage. They could not comprehend being outbuilt by an enemy who treated warfare as an engineering problem to be solved through systematic application of industrial resources. Feldwebel Karl-Heinz fought on both the Eastern and Western fronts, and his 1975 interview explained the fundamental difference in his experience. Against Soviet forces, he explained, Germans fought battles in the traditional sense. Against Americans, they fought factories. When German forces destroyed a Russian position, it remained destroyed until Soviet reserves could be brought forward to retake it. When German forces destroyed an American position, it was rebuilt before German units could reload their weapons. The Russians possessed courage and numerical superiority. The Americans possessed bulldozers and steel matting. Heinz admitted he feared the bulldozers more than he feared Russian infantry. The portable airfield technology reached its ultimate expression in Operation Varsity, the airborne assault crossing of the Rhine in March 1945. American engineers jumped with the initial paratroop waves, carrying lightweight aluminum planking specifically designed for rapid runway construction in airborne operations, where heavy equipment could not initially be employed. Within 6 hours of landing behind enemy lines, they had established landing zones for gliders carrying additional equipment and supplies. Within 12 hours, they operated an airstrip capable of evacuating wounded personnel and bringing in supplies, all without connection to friendly ground forces. German commanders, observing this development, realized that American forces had achieved the ultimate military flexibility. They could establish air superiority anywhere on Earth, instantly, regardless of terrain conditions or enemy opposition. General der Fallschirmjäger Hermann Bernhard Ramke commanded Germany's most experienced airborne forces, and watching American airborne engineers work forced him to a bitter admission. Germans had invented airborne warfare as a military concept, but Americans had perfected it beyond German imagination. German paratroopers could seize objectives through audacious assault. American paratroopers could build permanent bases. German airborne forces could capture existing airfields. American airborne forces could create airfields from nothing. Americans had industrialized even the most elite and specialized forms of warfare. bringing their characteristic engineering approach to operations that Germans considered the domain of military artistry. The contrast with German construction methods became increasingly stark as the war progressed toward its inevitable conclusion. Luftwaffe construction units, the Luftwaffe Bautruppen, operated using methods essentially unchanged since the First World War. They relied overwhelmingly on manual labor, frequently employing forced workers and prisoners of war to compensate for lack of mechanical equipment. A typical German airfield construction project in 1944 might employ 5,000 workers laboring for 3 months to achieve results that an American aviation engineer battalion could accomplish with 800 men in 3 days. General Major Walter Grabman commanded the 3rd Fighter Division, and his description of inspecting a captured American airfield in France revealed his struggle to reconcile what he observed with his understanding of military engineering. Everything at the American facility was temporary in nature, yet completely functional. The control tower consisted of prefabricated wood sections that could be dismantled within hours, yet it contained better communications equipment than permanent German concrete installations. Hangars appeared to be circus tents constructed of canvas and steel tubing, yet they protected aircraft more effectively than German concrete structures because damage could be quickly repaired or entire sections replaced. Grabman characterized it as the architecture of victory: substance without permanence, capability without commitment to any particular location. The cultural implications extended far beyond purely military considerations. German military tradition valued permanence and monumentalism, creating engineering works that would endure for generations as testaments to German technical skill. Pre-war Luftwaffe airfields featured Art Deco terminal buildings and monumentalist hangars designed to make architectural statements about German power and sophistication. American airfields were purely functional, designed to last exactly as long as operationally necessary and not one day longer. This philosophical difference reflected deeper disparities in how the two nations conceptualized warfare itself. Professor Heinrich Focke, designer of Focke-Wulf aircraft, visited American-constructed airfields after his capture and wrote observations about the fundamental differences in engineering philosophy. German engineering, he noted, sought perfection and ideal solutions that would endure essentially forever. American engineering sought adequacy and rapid solutions that would function effectively today without concern for permanence. In peacetime, the German approach might produce superior results. In warfare, adequacy delivered today proved infinitely more valuable than perfection delivered next month. The repair capabilities proved as operationally decisive as initial construction speed. During the Battle of the Bulge, German commanders counted on winter weather grounding Allied aircraft and permitting their offensive to proceed without air interference. They failed to calculate that American engineers could clear snow from PSP runways within minutes using specialized equipment, while German concrete runways remained unusable for days until manual labor crews could clear them. The ability to maintain air operations in weather conditions that grounded the Luftwaffe provided Americans a decisive advantage that German planning had not anticipated. The psychological impact on Luftwaffe pilots proved profound and demoralizing. Unlike attacks on permanent installations where cumulative damage could eventually render them unusable, attacks on American airfields seemed completely pointless. Young German pilots, already facing overwhelming numerical odds in the air, lost motivation for missions that achieved nothing lasting. Squadron veterans reported that morale collapsed when intelligence briefings revealed that airfields successfully attacked had returned to full operational status within hours. Lieutenant Wolfgang Fischer flew the revolutionary Messerschmitt 262 jet fighter, one of Germany's last technological hopes for achieving air superiority despite American numerical advantages. His description of operational experience revealed the futility of even technological superiority against American engineering capabilities. The jets provided a decisive speed advantage that should have been tactically decisive. But speed meant nothing when enemies possessed airfields everywhere across the operational theatre. German jets could outrun American fighters, but could not outrun American geography. Every emergency landing field Germans might employ had been destroyed or captured. Every field Americans required appeared overnight wherever needed. The production statistics underlying American airfield construction capabilities defied German comprehension even when the numbers were laid out in clear documentation. The United States produced sufficient PSP matting to cover 200 square miles of terrain, using steel resources that Germany desperately needed for tank and submarine construction. The manufacturing process required precision engineering and quality control standards that German factories, operating under constant bombing and severe resource constraints, could never have maintained at scale. Yet Americans produced PSP alongside record quantities of aircraft, ships, vehicles, and every other implement of modern warfare. Albert Speer served as Hitler's armaments minister, responsible for German war production, and he initially studied captured American production statistics and concluded they must be propaganda fabrications. When post-war analysis confirmed their complete accuracy, he admitted that Germans could not conceive of such industrial capacity because it exceeded not merely German capabilities, but German imagination. The Americans were not simply fighting a different war with different methods. They were fighting in an entirely different century, employing industrial capabilities that seemed to belong to some future era. The legacy of American airfield engineering haunted German military professionals long after the war's conclusion. In NATO planning sessions during the 1950s, former Wehrmacht officers would interrupt discussions of Soviet military capabilities to ask detailed questions about airfield construction capacity, traumatized by their wartime experience of American engineering overwhelming traditional military calculations. General Franz Halder, former chief of the German General Staff, wrote in his memoirs about the fundamental nature of German miscalculation. German planners had prepared for every military contingency except one, that their enemy would simply build their way to victory. Americans treated Europe as an enormous construction site, and they possessed the industrial tools to reshape it according to their operational requirements. Germany's finest tactical minds were defeated not by superior generalship, but by American bulldozers and prefabricated materials. The transformation of warfare that American aviation engineers represented transcended mere technical capability improvements. They embodied an approach to military problems that treated traditional constraints as engineering challenges to be solved through systematic application of resources and industrial methods, rather than as limitations to be accepted and incorporated into planning. Mountains, rivers, swamps, and distances that had shaped European warfare for millennia became minor inconveniences to be bulldozed, bridged, drained, or simply ignored through the application of American engineering solutions. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, reflecting on the Italian campaign during his post-war imprisonment, provided perhaps the most eloquent German summary of their bewilderment. Germans were inheritors of Clausewitz and Moltke, masters of operational art, students of 2,000 years of European military history. They understood how to fight in every terrain type, under every conceivable condition, against every variety of enemy. But Americans did not fight terrain in the traditional sense. They transformed terrain to suit their operational requirements. They did not accept battlefield conditions as given. They created new conditions through engineering. They did not defeat German forces in battle through superior tactics. They built their victory systematically, piece by piece, runway by runway, until German expertise became irrelevant and German experience worthless. The final humiliation for German military professionals came during the occupation period, when they were required to attend American engineering demonstrations as part of their re-education. They watched aviation engineer battalions construct complete operational airfields in timed exercises, accomplishing in hours what German doctrine stated required weeks of intensive effort. Veterans reported leaving these demonstrations in tears, finally understanding with complete clarity the totality of their miscalculation about the nature of modern warfare. Colonel Joachim Müncheberg, a highly decorated fighter pilot credited with 135 aerial victories, attended such a demonstration in 1946 and wrote to his wife describing the experience. He had watched American engineers construct in 4 hours what German forces could not have built in 4 weeks. He finally understood why Germany lost the war. Germans had brought warriors to what was fundamentally an industrial competition. They believed courage and skill would triumph over material superiority. They failed to comprehend that Americans would make their material superiority so overwhelming that German courage became operationally irrelevant. The final accounting provided a numerical epilogue to German military pride. American aviation engineers constructed 235 major airfields in Europe alone, not counting hundreds of emergency strips and temporary facilities that were used briefly and then abandoned. They laid sufficient PSP matting to construct a highway extending from London to Istanbul. They moved enough earth to excavate a canal from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. They achieved construction rates that German engineers, even employing slave labour in massive quantities, never approached. In the Pacific theatre, the statistics proved even more staggering. American engineers transformed coral atolls into major air bases, built runways through jungle terrain that German observers had assessed as impossible to develop, and created operational facilities on islands that German strategic analysts had dismissed as militarily unusable. The ultimate achievement came at Tinian, where American engineers constructed what was then the world's largest airfield complex in 1944, 6 runways each exceeding 8,000 feet in length, from which B-29 Superfortress bombers would launch the atomic attacks that ended the war. Vice Admiral Friedrich Ruger served as Germany's senior naval engineer, and his study of American construction methods during post-war internment produced a stark conclusion. Germans measured military power in traditional terms: divisions of troops, numbers of ships, quantities of aircraft. Americans measured military power in tons of concrete poured, miles of runway laid, cubic yards of earth moved. Germans were correct that modern industrial war would be decided by industrial capacity. They simply never imagined that industrial capacity could be projected directly onto the battlefield itself, that factories could serve as weapons as surely as artillery pieces. The revolution in military engineering that American aviation engineers represented fundamentally transformed the nature of warfare for all subsequent conflicts. The capability to create air superiority anywhere through engineering rather than combat operations rendered traditional military geography obsolete. Distance from established bases, terrain obstacles, seasonal weather conditions, all the factors that had governed military operations throughout human history became minor variables in American operational planning rather than determining constraints. General Heinz Guderian, architect of German armoured warfare doctrine and the Blitzkrieg concept that conquered most of Europe, provided a final assessment that captured the existential shock to German military thinking. Germans had perfected mobile warfare, the lightning war that had overrun France in 6 weeks. But Americans achieved something conceptually greater: mobile infrastructure. They did not merely move armies rapidly across terrain. They moved entire civilizations. They brought their complete industrial base directly to the battlefield, assembled it under fire, and operated it in active combat zones. Germans were still fighting the previous war's battles, while Americans were inventing entirely new forms of warfare. The story of German encounters with American airfield construction capabilities ultimately constitutes a narrative of conceptual defeat at the most fundamental level. The Wehrmacht, inheritor of centuries of European military tradition and fresh from stunning victories across the continent, found itself facing an opponent who had transcended that entire tradition. American aviation engineers did not defeat German military art through superior execution of traditional methods. They made traditional military art irrelevant by changing the fundamental rules governing warfare. They demonstrated that in modern industrial war, the capability to build proved more powerful than the capability to destroy. That systematic creation could overwhelm tactical destruction, that engineering excellence could triumph over operational brilliance. SS Obergruppenführer Paul Hauser, one of Germany's most decorated and respected commanders, provided perhaps the most poignant epitaph for German military presumptions during conversations with American interrogators after his capture. Americans had constantly claimed they would win the war because they could outproduce Germany, he recalled. German officers had laughed at this claim, assuming Americans meant they would produce more tanks and aircraft. Germans failed to understand that Americans meant they would literally produce the battlefield itself, that they would manufacture the very ground combat was fought upon. Americans did not defeat the Wehrmacht through superior tactics or strategy. They bypassed German military excellence entirely, building their victory on runways that did not exist when battles commenced. German generals who had studied Napoleon's campaigns in minute detail, who could quote Clausewitz from memory and debate the finer points of Schlieffen's strategic concepts, who understood every principle of European warfare developed over centuries of conflict, found themselves undone by American teenagers operating bulldozers and laying interlocking steel planks. They had prepared meticulously for every conceivable form of warfare except the one they actually faced: industrial construction executed at battlefield pace, engineering employed as a weapon system, construction operations as a form of combat. In the final analysis, German military professionals were confronted with a truth too bitter to fully accept or acknowledge. They had not been outfought in any traditional sense, but rather outbuilt by an enemy with fundamentally different conceptions of how wars were won. The finest army in Europe, arguably the finest army in human history to that point, had been defeated not by superior strategy or tactics or courage, but by an adversary who could transform wheat fields into operational air bases overnight, who could repair in hours what required days to destroy, who fought not merely with weapons and soldiers, but with steel matting and bulldozers and an industrial mindset that could not be defeated by traditional military methods. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, signing Germany's unconditional surrender, reportedly told General Eisenhower that Germans had known they would face American industrial capacity, but had not anticipated facing it directly on the battlefield, in the form of engineers who could build faster than Germans could destroy. Eisenhower's reply, if the anecdote is accurately recorded, was characteristically direct. That fundamental misunderstanding, he suggested, explained why Germany lost. The legacy endures in military doctrine practiced worldwide to this day. Modern warfare universally assumes rapid airfield construction, forward operating base development, and expeditionary engineering as fundamental military capabilities that any competent force must possess. The revolution that shocked German generals in 1943 has become so thoroughly routine that modern military officers literally cannot imagine warfare conducted without these capabilities. Yet for Wehrmacht officers who first witnessed American engineers unrolling runways from trucks like enormous carpets, it represented the moment their familiar world ended and an entirely new age of warfare commenced. They had expected to fight Americans as they had fought other enemies. They had not expected Americans to abolish the battlefield itself as they understood it, replacing traditional terrain with an industrial landscape that appeared and disappeared according to operational requirements rather than geographic reality. They had not imagined that their enemy's greatest weapon would prove to be not any tank or aircraft or artillery piece, but rather the capability to transform any piece of terrain into a functioning airbase, instantly, repeatedly, and unstoppably. German generals, steeped in military tradition, extending back to Frederick the Great, never conceived that American engineers would unroll airstrips from trucks overnight, like merchants unrolling bolts of cloth. Their miscalculation on this single point, more than any battle or campaign or strategic decision, explains why the Wehrmacht, unquestionably master of continental warfare by all traditional measures, found itself helpless before an enemy who had industrialized victory itself. Germans brought a military force to what was fundamentally an engineering competition, and they lost before they even understood the true nature of the contest they had entered.